I'll introduce myself. Some of you know me already, some of you don't. So thank you to Lewis for inviting me here today to talk about this subject. So my name is Kevin. Some of you know me. This is my sign name, Kevin. And I'll let Natalie introduce herself. She's an interpreter that works here regularly. So my job role is a graduate research fellow. So I've got two roles here at the university. One of the roles is teaching. Some of you are teaching, some of the students are here, so BSL. So, you know, here to watch and learn, brilliant. And it's a challenge for myself and a challenge for them because it's the first year of my teaching. And I've also been doing deaf cultures. Some of you are students that I taught last year as well. And then the other part of my role is I am doing a PhD, and this is a subject area that I am looking into. So for myself, it's something that is a big challenge. It's intersectionality. I am deaf, and then it's very, very rare in terms of black researchers. There's a lot of discrimination in terms of, there's a lot of research linked to racism and what's happened with black people, but there's not been a lot of information linked to racism and audism. So this is why this title, intersectionality, is, we have a sign for it. There's lots of different signs for intersectionality, but it's the cross between the two cultures. So some people sign it in different ways. They sign it depending on the context. So for example, you've got people from different areas who have come from Africa, and then they've come over here, and they have different viewpoints depending on their experiences that have happened to themselves in terms of oppression. Whether it's been audism or racism. So you have this dual oppression that happens that I will talk about later. So far, in terms of the research, I have been conducting interviews. I've conducted 7 interviews so far, and I've been gathering research on the subject area in intersectionality. This lady herself, Kimberly Crenshaw. So this was in 1989, she started using this word. It had been used before then, the concept was being used, but there wasn't actually a name given to this concept. There was a lot of different theories that's happening particularly in America historically, but she was the lady that first created this key concept of intersectionality. So Patricia Hill Collins, she really is one of the founders of it. She wrote the book The Matrix of Domination and the 4 Domains of Power back in 2005. And she's explaining about the power, who has the power. I will just write down the 4 domains. So I will do a presentation, and then if you've got any questions, you can ask them at the end, okay? So just to explain, the 4 domains of power, so there's structural. So structural would mean, for example, the NHS, who has the power, who's in the power structure, who's on the bottom levels, whether it be deaf people or the minority groups, and who affected. It's the power, who is running the structural institutional level, and who is it actually affecting. Then you've got the second domain, which is the hegemonic. So whether it's in school, you've got churches, who is controlling those areas? Is it the priests or the people there? And who is controlling the congregation? So that would be the power structure there in the hegemonic system. You then come down to the third domain, which would be the hierarchy of groups, so who is in control, who is explaining their beliefs, who has the power, who's more superior in influencing what they believe and passing that on to everybody else. So then you come down to the whole concept of white privilege and what's happened there as to who has the power in society, and that's being the interpersonal level. And the fourth domain comes down to the disciplinary. So is it a policy level that's affected individual, whether it's affected black people, down to the policy that's been in place. So Patricia Hill created these four domains of power. The lady in the middle, Claudia Jones Triple, again, she is somebody who has enriched the area of feminist, the black feminist perception. So before the Cumberbatch, Claudia Jones, Cumberbatch, so before then, she decided not to change her name, so that was before she was married. So she moved to America, and again, she was really fighting the movement and what was happening with the racism and oppression. She was looking in America and what was happening with looking at the women and the three domains of oppression that women were facing. They were facing the fact that they were looking at, it was white women were above the black men in the privilege system, and then it became in the more political, and it was these three layers of oppression that the women were facing. She then moved to London, and sadly she died, but really what was really interesting when we were looking at her grave, I'm sure some of you have researched, but Karl Marx, so the communist Karl Marx, her grave is really nearby because she was a very, very strong black feminist Marxist lady. The last lady on there, Angela Davis, she wrote the book Women, Race and Class back in 1981. Back in 1981, obviously in America there was a lot of division there. You had the Black Lives Matter, you had the police, and they were being really suspicious of a black lady being involved in politics. So herself, she was one of the most wanted criminals in America. It was unbelievable when you're thinking about it now, but she was one of the most wanted criminals. She was a real expert, and now she is working at one of the top universities in America. So these three are some of the founders of the black feminist perspectives on intersectionality. So this is a little bit about myself and my background, the autoethnography perspective. There are four key parts. There's the question, there's the analysis, there's the actual writing of the PhD, and collecting the data and analysing that data. The reason why, if I'm not involved, people might look and they might be thinking, why are you starting looking at this experience? How do you as a person fit in? So it's really important that I explain my heritage and my background and how I fit into the PhD and why I'm starting to do this research. So looking at the audism and racism and what's happened to myself, and that is why I have come to start researching this area. So this is a bit of background about myself. So really from my first marriage, I was married to a Jamaican, but the two daughters have grown up. My two daughters have grown up signing, the same as Lewis himself. His parents are deaf, and he's grown up signing. It means that internally they have this dual cultural perspective. In school, I was in a mainstream, but the teachers, I was in a deaf school, but the teachers were hearing, so it was mostly done through a bit of sign and through an oral approach. So I got my BA and MA, and again at hearing universities, I was the only deaf person, and the struggles that I had to go through going through the BA and the MA, and what happened at a university level, it was unbelievable, the inequality and the barriers faced from a deaf perspective. When I got the level 6 NVQ and BSL, again you'd think because I'm deaf it would be easy. It wasn't at all. I just jumped straight to level 6. I didn't do any of the level 1, level 2 sections that people usually do. I did it across 9 months, and it took me 9 months to achieve the MVQ level 6. But again, for a deaf person, it was really difficult to achieve. I married a British deaf Nigerian lady, and I will explain a bit more about that later, but that's also influenced the research that I've been doing. And I've worked as a community support worker for the adult mental health section in London. And I left that and moved to this job at York St John. So that's a bit of background about myself and how I've come to do this research. So there's really 2 key parts of the intersectionality for myself. There's a lot of other areas out there that could be covered, but for myself it's really the 2 different types of oppression that have been faced. A lot of people historically have no idea, because educationally you were educated by white teachers, you'd be educated by the white working class. You were never educated, you didn't see the black deaf role models. You might not have communication at home, your families might not be able to sign. So accessing and understanding this oppression was very difficult for a lot of black deaf people. So when you're talking about ableism and trying to fight and change that and spreading that message out, it's been really similar in terms of talking about sign language and what's happened to how sign language has been oppressed. Historically, there's been a lot of oppression within sign language. So for example, if you went to a British Nigerian restaurant, the way that you would eat at a table would be very different in terms of the waiter or the staff and how they would treat you compared to your hearing counterpart. The way that they would speak, it's the same culture, so they would speak very similarly to the hearing Nigerian person, but yourself coming from it from a deaf perspective, the way that they would speak to you, they'd look down at you, they'd speak to you very differently. They had no deaf awareness, they had nothing. So they had a horrific attitude if you go in. Coming from a Jamaican perspective is very different. You'd have this sort of coming up, and again you'd get the culture shock. The behaviour was very different between the Nigerian and the Jamaican. So it wasn't just the African attitude, it was very much depending on where you're from and depending on what was happening with the heritage. So myself, I came from a family that was an oralist family. So when I was introduced to my wife's mother, the mother-in-law was almost talking to the daughter and saying, oh, can he speak? And saying, no, we sign, this is how we communicate. And really they had no understanding or awareness about sign language. And we really had to educate both my parents and the in-laws about how we communicate. There's been a lot of conflicts between the 2 cultures. So coming from the African and the British African cultures, so you already have that cross-cultural issues going on. You have them saying, well, the cultural differences that are appearing. So historically back in the time, it was really looking at what do you mean? So you'd look at people's actual scars. So going back looking in Nigeria and what was happening, you'd look at people's scars, and that would be explaining the stories of what happened. Now things have changed, and it's the attitude historically was horrific. And really now it's looking at the attitude and how the attitude of discrimination has continued through the generations. So when you're looking back in terms of, so I know Lewis himself comes from a Jamaican heritage, and it's really when you're looking at the percentage of people from the Western Africa and the slaves and what was happening historically, and really what was happening in Europe, they were just the way that they were treating people was horrific. So when you're looking in terms of black history and what was happening, and you're looking in the 70s, there was a massive campaign that started trying to get the attitudes to change over here and make to stop this oppression that was happening. So in terms of the history with the political conflicts and the tensions between the British African people and the British Caribbean people, there was a real conflict between the 2, and it's how they started to accept each other. So looking at myself and my wife, we were a perfect example of that, looking at the Jamaican culture and looking at the Nigerian culture and looking at this heritage and where it's come from. The matriarchality, that is a new concept that was new to myself. And again, looking in the Caribbean and what was happening, it's really been, it's only been brought up to me recently, this concept. But really it was focusing on a single parent. So it would usually be the mother is the central member of the family. The father usually wasn't around, they were growing up in a single household. So myself, it happened, my mother was extremely strict and she was a tough woman. She was very kind, but she was extremely tough. So growing up, when you looked, you had that female mother figure. If I was hearing, I might have had a very different experience, and it might have been, if you were in trouble or something, but because I was deaf, I wasn't able to, my mother wasn't able to speak to me in the same manner. It was a very different culture, because I had the two cultures of both deafness and the Black Caribbean experience. So when my two daughters were younger, and they were growing up, when I was trying to tell them off, it was extremely difficult because for me, my voice wasn't very great. They'd have to look at me with signing, so I used to bring my mother in, and my mother's voice was extremely harsh. As soon as she came in, and the Jamaican voice, some of you may know, is extremely harsh, and the children used to listen to her. And again, it's a cultural thing, it's a cultural concept that I used to have to bring my mother in to tell the children off. So, she was a wise old lady that we used to bring in when we needed. So going down to the bottom, this concept of dowry and libation. So the dowry, there's a lot of cultural countries that again they still use this dowry concept. For myself, it was new to me when I married my wife. So they were saying to me, "Oh, you don't have to," but if I was Nigerian, they would expect me to. So it didn't matter if you were deaf or hearing; it's a cultural thing that if you're Nigerian, you're expected to pay a dowry to your wife's family. However, they said with me coming from a different country, I had to become pay this libation towards my wife's family. So it's almost like giving a gift. So it's just to share and recognise that you are understanding the Nigerian community and culture. It's a really important part because it's understanding the awareness of those, looking at the heritage, looking at what's happened traditionally. And in terms of a dowry in the future, the modern world, the dowry is changing, that's not happening so much. But again, it's been this shift, and you still have this libation to pay homage to the traditions. So then you have deaf acculturation. So it's usually in your family. Most of the time, deaf people come from hearing families. The only time that they start to learn sign is going to a deaf school where they start influencing and picking up, and that's how they acquire the language. If you are hearing individuals, it's very different when you're going to school. You already have that language. Whereas for a deaf person, when you're in a hearing family, you don't get access to the deaf community and deaf culture around you. So you don't get to acquire that culture. So that's why a lot of the time, if you go to a deaf specialist school, that is where you acquire the culture. That is where you pick up on the nuances of the language. You start learning about sign language. Mm-hmm. This is where the question of identity can come into conflict. It can be a real problem because you have your family who are hearing and they're influencing you. They've never signed to you about what's happened historically to yourselves. I'm sure when you're talking about black history back in before the 1970s, there's very, very little information that was out there. Because people were looking at the West and they weren't wanting to go away from the status quo and explain what had happened historically. There were very few photographs that were there, and I'm sure if you start looking, I'm sure black hearing people were able to pick up on that understanding because they'd get the information passed down through the generations. But if you were deaf, you didn't have access to that. You were in a hearing family and you weren't picking up on the identity. You had to really search, and so a lot of people didn't understand that they had this dual identity going on. And it took a long time for people to understand this concept. It's only when it started being normalised on mainstream television that people were actually starting to realise that they had an identity. So this book that was published. It was back in 1991, A Change in Approach. And it was a really good starting step. It was one of the foundations of developing this black identity for black deaf people. So I'll let you just read this a bit. So there's lots of reasons about why black deaf people have no understanding about their history. They didn't have access to information. Maybe the family weren't signing. It might be this incidental learning where they weren't privy to a lot of that information. The book explained about how a lot of children growing up in hearing families weren't being taught about the history. They weren't being taught about the issues that black people were facing. So it's really important that disability and deaf studies should really think about it the other way around, that it should be black disability and black deaf theoretical framework. So when you're thinking about the theories and thinking about the three different theories, you have the race, you have the class, and you have the gender. And those three things that Claudia Jones was talking about, empowering for the three oppressions for the deaf, for the black women, was what could really influence everybody else. So then you came on to this in 1993. So it's called, on the left-hand side, so it was called the black. Sorry, I'm getting to write it. So, sorry, London sign. So, Natalie's just double checking what I was talking about. So the black and white signs. So talking about individual people and talking about the black and white and the signs that we used. So historically there used to be signs used that were not necessarily correct. People would be saying it's very offensive. So when you start seeing, you can say which signs do you think would be offensive? Any of you that know sign language? And why would it be offensive? So you're talking about the third one. Anyone else? So Faith. She feels it's the one would be very offensive. Of the pictures, it's the one very much to the right. So you're talking about, it would be talking about blackface in terms of the sign. So a lot of white deaf people would be teaching these studies, and this really needs to be changed. So it's talking about, it's exactly the same as the word Negro. It had that negative connotation, and it's exactly the same in terms of the sign. It had this negative connotation. That's why a lot of people started saying, actually we needed to start and campaigning for this positive, the positive sign started needing to be used rather than this offensive sign used historically. This is myself, this is my, the picture of myself, and now there is another sign for black. Really that's used for informal, and interpreters would never use that. It's not a professional sign, just to let you know. It's an informal that black people would talk about themselves. It's an informal sign that they would use, talking about the black community. How old do you think I was back then? Any ideas? Come on, guess. No, I want you to have a guess. So, this guy's 61. So again, he doesn't look it. He's 61. So this is the whole So the sign for black, or this sign for black, but really for the reason why it would be used for white, or it would be used because of the superiority and it would almost be like that people, it would be a political argument people will use as second-class citizen. So there's a lot of reasons for the sign, which is why it is now being used, but it is definitely an informal sign. So this quote is extremely true. So through the PhD, it's when I started the PhD, really, I start looking back now, realise how naive I was. And really, the more you learn, the more you realise you don't know, and the more questions you need to ask. If you ask, you don't understand, and the more that you ask, the more you will find out. So, for example, in the library is full of things. It's really worth going and actually spending time, because the more you start questioning, the longer you will start questioning everything. So this quote is very true. Yeah. This is the sign. And this quote is that not understanding. The more that you don't understand, the more you fear. And that's where ignorance grows from. So the best defence that you can do is knowledge. Okay, so that's it, my slide. Has anybody got any questions? Over to you. Has anyone got any questions that you would like to ask me?
Is there a universally accepted sign for black, or is it, because at the university we're always having conversations about should we say BAME or ethnic minority, is it the same kind of debate with which signs to use?
That's a really interesting question. So in America, it's completely different. So obviously American Sign Language is very different to over here. So they use the sign black, and that has been used historically for a long time. So from segregation, that was the sign that was being used. In Britain, we've had a lot more of a debate over the issue with the sign. Because in America they had the segregation with the schools, black people were continually allowed to sign, so it meant that they continually had that development of language. Over here, we didn't have segregation, so it's been an issue in terms of the vocabulary. So it's been really interesting because in South Africa, so similar when you're looking at their language, the way that there'd be in oral schools, there'd be in families speaking at home, and the way the white individuals would be having to continue orally, whereas the black families and the black deaf people were allowed to continue signing. So it was almost this separation between the white deaf people were having to go down the oral route, whereas the black deaf people were allowed to continue signing, so the language changed. So again, it changed in terms of how things were recorded, and again, it depends historically how things have changed. And it's the same as any language, whether it's writing or whether it's signed. Language is continually evolving and changing and developing. So it's really interesting because there was some information that had been filmed historically, but in terms of the answer, the simple answer is universally no, there is not one universal sign. But does that answer your question? In a roundabout way? Yep. Any more questions?
Would you say that the deaf community is quite reluctant in changing signs? Because for my dissertation I'm doing about political correctness, and I watched a video in the YouTube comments. There were people who were like, I don't want to change because it's what I know. I'm not racist. It's just what I know.
That's a really good question, and it's a really interesting one. So a lot of it comes down, it's a very contentious issue, and the problem is, it's like a lot of, within the hearing communities, there's a lot of racism awareness. You can see what's happening. The education within deaf people and deaf communities has been really difficult. So a lot of people have never been able to challenge a system or challenge language. Within the hearing communities, there's regularly been this, actually we can challenge this. They've understood because they've had access to all this incidental learning, they've had access to all this understanding of what's been going on within the system and society. For deaf people, they haven't had the same access. The education has been extremely poor. So trying to actually allow the people to be assertive and challenge things and challenge language, that's why it's taken a lot longer, and it's been really sad because when you're looking back in 90%, of the deaf education is done by white people. That's the majority of people, which means the majority of people who are black is very, very minimal compared to the white majority. So therefore, they're the ones influencing the language. So that can be where that comes from. Does that answer? Does that answer the question? Yeah? Any more questions?
Is Kevin seeing a change from a generational perspective of younger black deaf children understanding intersectionality and their deafhood more than the older black generations?
Yes. So what's important is black deaf history. So I absolutely love history. That is one of my passions. I'm really interested and looking at the power of media and looking at what's happening, the power of, particularly the power of social media. So for it's not just black history, but looking at the black deaf history, and the younger generation are able to access that more. So for example, historically, Jamaica was able to access sign language, and through what, sorry? Sorry. The wrong place. Barbados, thank you. Barbados. So for example, with Barbados, they had sign language historically as well. So when you're going back to the three women that I was talking about, and Claudia Jones, the lady in the middle, and Cumberbatch, and looking at the black feminist perspective, when you're talking about the single feminist person, you're talking about the deaf individual as well. So a lot of black deaf people, they didn't really know about the history. They were told they weren't allowed to sign. They were told that they weren't able to access this. So when you're talking about the rights and understanding the rights and trying to influence people, that was a really key point, saying actually you have the same rights. And a lot of people in terms of black history, they didn't understand. So when they started saying the black deaf history, people were like, oh, we don't even know about that. We need to challenge the system. We need to challenge what's happening. And that's really important, people understanding that and being able and allowed to challenge. Any more questions? Lewis, anything you want to add?
Thank you.
Lovely. If you do get any questions, you think, I wish I would have asked Kevin that, just email me. More than welcome to email me anytime about it. I'm more than happy to respond. So happy Black History